Presenters all. Sophie was suddenly struck by how fed up she was with school. Lessons no longer had any meaning for her. Working in groups only lent a platform for the show-offs in the class to impose themselves. And teachers. Yes, teachers. How Sophie wished they would all shut up. From the time you arrived until the time you were walking through the school gate at the end of the day, teachers were ever present. If they were not lecturing the class on a boring topic, they were telling someone off for not listening or laying down the law about acceptable behaviour. Otherwise, their talk was a long-winded answer to a silly question. Have you ever wondered how sweets are made? Why does the tide come up and down every 6 hours? Sophie's answer would have been no, but rhetorical questions allow no debate and offer no introduction to a discussion. How Sophie wished teachers were controlled by something like the television remote. Sophie's remote would have the mute button pressed permanently. And how she wished she could shut teachers' voices out of her head. At 3:45 p.m, Sophie, along with 499 other children, were liberated from their teachers' tongues. Having packed away their books and stationery in their desks and left the room in an orderly fashion, they spilled out of the door and into the playground. She saw Jessica, her bestest friend in the whole world, at the school gate waiting for her. Don't you get fed up with blooming teachers? Sophie snarled. Jessica said she got fed up with them too and promptly changed the subject. Otherwise, she would have been drawn into a moan fest by Sophie that would last all the way home. Jessica suggested they go out on their bikes that evening. Sophie arrived at her front gate. After some tea and digestive biscuits, she adjourned to an armchair and switched on the television. She watched a close-up of a slightly trembling hand cut out a circle from a piece of white card. Now stick this to the end of the toilet roll insert, the presenter said. Sophie sighed impatiently. She turned to another channel that was showing You'll Never Believe This, featuring a man banging a tin tray on his head while singing about Andy the Wonder Ass. She turned back to another close-up of a quivering hand squeezing transparent glue from a tiny tube. By now, your kaleidoscope should be taking shape, the presenter said, reaching out of shot to bring out a near-completed kaleidoscope. Here's one I made earlier. Now, all you need is some acrylic paint, proper eye protection, rubber gloves, and an environment-friendly boiler suit. Cut to attractive elder sisterly presenter in the above-listed get-up. Another presenter, a younger female, came on to remind young viewers to cordon the work area off with yellow and black health and safety tape. And always have 2 adults with you at all times, one to do the risk assessment and pass the tools to you, the other to keep a carbon dioxide fire extinguisher on hand and a roll of light gauze in case anything goes horribly wrong with your kaleidoscope. Sophie scowled and hollered at the television. You make me sick! The television switched off. She threw the remote across the room. She rose and stomped out of the house. Seconds later, she was outside Jessica's front door. She found her bestest friend cross-legged on the floor in front of the television watching that program. Yes, the one with the presenters talking down to the nation's youth. Ready? Sophie asked. Jessica did not answer. She was enthralled by another presenter with the boyish good looks. He was shouting into the camera about how fizzy drinks are made. Behind him, Rows of empty bottles jostled for position on a conveyor belt before being fed into a machine that would sterilize them. Sophie trod heavily out of the room, even though the offending program had another 12 minutes to go. But a dozen more minutes was not worth the torture. She mounted her bicycle and pedalled furiously to the junction of the cul-de-sac and the main road. She wondered where she would go on her own. The enthusiasm drained away quickly. She dismounted and wheeled her machine to the sweet shop a few yards away. The bell tinged heartily as she pushed the door open. The woman, in a light blue shop coat, took up her position behind the counter in front of a row of large glass jars containing selections of boiled sweets in garish wrappings. Mrs. Grundy, the shop woman, seemed tense, as if she were waiting for her cue to speak. Sophie asked for a quarter pound of sherbet lemons. Mrs. Grundy smiled broadly and said, "Have you ever wondered how sherbet lemons are made?" Dumbfounded, Sophie looked at the woman. "Let's consider the ingredients: sugar, cornstarch, colouring, saccharin, and a flavouring, which is a secret known only to the manufacturer." Sophie could not believe that she was being subjected to this lecture. Meanwhile, Mrs. Grundy hoisted a television from under the counter and switched it on. On the screen, Mrs. Grundy was wearing a factory overall and a paper hat. She spoke into a microphone, enunciating her words to compete with the factory noise in the background. "The word sherbet is from the Turkish sherbet, and ultimately from the Arabic shariba, which means he drank, as sherbet lemons were originally served in goblets and drunk at parties during the Crusades. Behind me is a vat into which all the ingredients are boiled before being piped. A quarter of sherbet lemons, please." Sophie butted in. "Shh! This is educational." Sophie flounced out of the shop, slamming the door behind her. The bell fell off. A car pulled into the curb outside the shop. The driver wound down the passenger side window and beckoned to Sophie, who hesitated because of her mother's warning not to accept lifts from strangers. "It's all right, sweetie," the motorist reassured her. Sophie went up to the car and peered down into the window. "Is there a cinema near here?" Sophie told the driver that the last cinema in the town had closed about 3 years before. "As I expected," the motorist began. "You see, as cinema had been in serious competition with television since 1953, when the Queen's coronation was televised and TV sets in their millions had been purchased in anticipation of that historic event, the decline of cinema as a mainstream entertainment was inevitable. Compounded with the rising popularity of home video and later DVD players, it was only a matter of time before the wholesale closure of cinemas in Great Britain." Although Sophie let this speech wash over her, she was stunned by the fact that a complete stranger would deliver a media studies lecture from inside his car. "Oh, shut up!" Sophie began to walk away. "No, don't. It's very interesting," the motorist persisted. "Especially when we get to the bit about the emergence of the multiplex and the spectacular shows offered by IMAX." Sophie walked away. The speech about the decline of British cinema and attempts to revive Ealing Studios faded into the increasing distance between the motorist and the fed-up girl. Meanwhile, a middle-aged woman was supervising her dog doing number twos outside someone's front gate. The woman sensed Sophie's passing. She straightened up, and having made sure that her dog's waste product had been picked up in a blue polythene bag, she began to follow the girl, brandishing the doggy poo. "I expect you're wondering what goes into this," the dog woman said. Sophie turned around, saw the woman and the dog, and tried to get on her bicycle. The woman caught up with the girl and held on to the handlebars as tightly as possible. "If you analyse this, you'll find out what Roby had for dinner today. You can check if he has any disease as well." "Oh, just go away!" Sophie shrieked. "Really?" The shocked woman took herself, her dog, and the bag of canine feces away. The dog cocked its head feebly, as if to ask what had got into its owner. The woman frowned, scolding. A few yards up the road, the automatic doors of a neighbourhood supermarket whipped open, and Sophie stepped in as unobtrusively as possible. No one noticed her entry. She joined a queue of 4 people whose plastic baskets contained an average of 6 items each. She scanned the rows of confectionery and decided to pick up a coconut-filled chocolate bar. No one volunteered to lecture about cocoa beans and the history of chocolate, from regal Mexican beverage to eating chocolate with sugar, emulsifier, and cocoa paste. Whew. Sophie was outside the supermarket. The chime of a kind used by ice cream vans filled the street. Sophie pressed her hands tightly to her ears. The sound came from a closed white van with question marks on it in various fonts, sizes, and colours. On the roof were 4 loudspeakers in a vintage design resembling apparatus that would have been fitted to private vehicles used for election campaigns in the 1950s. Sophie could not blot out the noise from the speakers. "I expect you're wondering what happens when humans perceive sound," boomed the voice. As the voice went into descriptions of rarefaction in the air and the inner ear, and the rear doors of the van flew open, and out jumped pairs of buck-toothed teenaged girls in white coats and inordinately large black-framed spectacles. Once on the pavement, they erected stands and boards bearing diagrams of canals and stirrup and hammer and the auditory nerves. White-coated wenches moved pointers over the diagrams in time with the substance of the commentary. Now Sophie was prone on the pavement as if she were expecting an explosion. Her arms quivered slightly as she pushed her palms over her ears. Then she passed out. When she regained consciousness, the van and the displays had gone. She felt someone leaning over her. A dog snuffled at her waist. "Stop that, Roby!" Sophie turned over and sat upright on the pavement. "You can't sleep there, dearie." Sophie was about to tell the woman to shut up, but it wasn't the woman who was speaking. "I expect you're wondering what happens to the human body when you sleep," the dog began. "The dog? Basically, your functions continue, albeit more slowly than during your waking hours. Your heartbeat slows and your temperature drops 1 or 2 degrees, which explains why you feel cold when you are suddenly woken up." "Why don't you dry up?" "Young lady, do hear me out," the dog implored. Sophie repeated her command several times. She lay on her stomach and pounded the pavement with her fists. "Oh, don't take on so, dearie," the dog said. "Do listen, he's a very clever dog," the woman chimed in. "He's got a chemistry set at home." "Yes," Roby said. "Look, this won't take long. Besides, I've got to be brief as I must hurry home." "He's got to do his poo analysis while it's still warm and fresh." Sophie shouted several words that she never thought she would ever utter, at least not to another person. A net curtain in a window across the street was drawn back suddenly. A woman jerked the dog's lead and proceeded down the road, leaving Sophie with a tear-streaked face and a voice made rough with loud cursing. I expect you're wondering what end means. Now, in literary terms, it is an arbitrary point at which the conflict is resolved and, as they say in formulaic style of fairy tales, and they lived happily ever after. In Sophie's case, we will never be sure whether her life will be happy ever after this point. In fact, the tear-streaked face and raucous voice may mark the beginning of a positive narrative, or at least a story with a happy ending. However, a newspaper headline might read, "Narrator, axed by girl, and you can shut your gob and all," said Sophie.